yeah, it's going to cost us money. It's going to cost a lot of money, but it's going to cost a lot less, not to mention the fact it's the morally correct thing to do if we aid Ukraine properly now. It's not a case that you can just put your head in the sand and pretend that this isn't happening. I'm sorry, it just isn't.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've got Kyiv-based journalist and foreign policy and security expert Jimmy Rushton on the show. And just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Jimmy, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thanks for having me again.
We'll have to talk about what's happened on Sunday night. A team of Ukrainian delegates met on Sunday with members of the Trump administration, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio and envoy Steve Witkoff. The specifics of the meeting and any sort of draft proposals wasn't really discussed publicly. We don't really know what happened, but we do know that Rubio described it as very productive, adding that there is a lot more work to be done, while Ukraine's delegates kind of backed that up and said that there was substantial progress, adding that Kyiv's core goals, security, sovereignty, and reliable peace remains unchanged. They said that that's also shared by the US side. Both sides added that they were basically building on the work that they had done last week in Geneva. So Witkoff will travel to Moscow today to discuss this with Putin. But Jimmy, are you optimistic, or have we seen this all before?
I think we've seen it all before. I'm slightly more optimistic than I was maybe a week ago, because it seems like the delegations in Miami were led by Marco Rubio, and he is very much the adult in the room when you're comparing him to Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. Witkoff, who obviously seems to be hopelessly compromised by the Russians at this stage, and Kushner, who is really has no qualifications, and the only reason that he's there is that he's the president's son-in-law. So I do think it's a more constructive tone. I think Kyiv will be relatively happy with the public optics of what happened. Rubio was talking about how Ukraine's sovereignty must be protected, so they'll be happy with that. But obviously with this administration, everything can change in a very short amount of time. So yeah, I think we have been here before, and we're obviously all waiting to see what will happen next.
Next stop is Moscow, as I mentioned. Steve Witkoff, he's reportedly set to meet with Vladimir Putin, or he'll meet with members of the Kremlin after a disastrous few days of headlines for him. So just for our audience, for the quick catch-up, audio files were leaked by Axios and the Financial Times last week, showing him coaching the Kremlin on how to speak to Donald Trump. This was recorded back in October, a few days before Trump was set to meet with Zelensky at the Oval Office. This saw several Republicans call for Steve Witkoff to be fired from his post. So do you think Trump should still be sending Witkoff to negotiate with Putin?
No. I mean, he's clearly operating more in his own personal interest and in the interests of Russia than he is in either America or Ukraine. It's astonishing, really. If you listen to or read, the transcripts of these calls, you have Dmitriev and Ushkov talking to each other, and they're essentially discussing how they're going to cook up this peace plan that they're going to give to the Americans. This was the 28-point plan, which was then seemingly machine translated from Russian into English, and then Witkoff just sold this as his plan, despite the fact he'd been given it directly from the Kremlin. And there was two transcripts that were published. The other transcript was Dmitriev talking to Witkoff, and Witkoff is coaching Dmitriev on how Putin should approach Trump, which is astonishing, really. You have an American diplomat telling an adversary how best to manipulate the American president. And it's just amazing. I almost can't believe it saying it to you. It's just so ridiculous. So no, he's not the right person. He should be nowhere near these negotiations. And he should go back to developing real estate in Florida or America or in New York or wherever he was working before.
On the note of, I guess, what the intentions are here, Jimmy, Wall Street Journal published an article last week which detailed that Trump's Ukraine peace plan is really a business deal with the Kremlin and Trump online investors aiming to reopen Russia's economy and channel Western, especially US capital, into energy, mining, and reconstruction programs. So projects. So it says that backers view the plan as a chance for American investors to get in first and profit from Russia's resources and post post-war rebuilding. So Witkoff is quoted in this article saying Russia has many vast resources, vast expanses of land. If we do all that and everybody's prospering and they'll all be a part of it and there's an upside for everybody, that's going to naturally be a bulwark against future conflict. So there's no outright denial or confirmation from Witkoff or the Trump administration. But if this is true and it all comes down to business, I mean, where does that leave Ukraine? If the argument is that by helping Russia prosper, especially in terms of its dwindling economy, perhaps it won't need to invade a sovereign country, but history and just, analysing Vladimir Putin would tell you that his intentions aren't about his economy. It's about taking more countries.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. It's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the way Putin thinks and the way Russia thinks generally. If you roll back the clock to before the full-scale invasion, Russia was not actually doing particularly badly in its economy. You saw them making an absolute fortune selling oil and gas to the West, particularly to Europe. You had Nord Stream 2 that was about to come online, and they were making a lot of money selling hydrocarbons to the rest of the world. That is now over. They are still selling oil and gas, but recent projections from Reuters showed that some of their revenues are down by 35% in November alone. It's really astonishing the way that Russia has essentially completely destroyed their own economy. They've killed probably nearly 1 million Russian men, not to mention how many Ukrainians they've killed in this ridiculous war of annihilation against the Ukrainian people. And, if, for example, Russia does become more prosperous at some point in the future, who's to say that they're not going to have another kind of spasm of revisionism and try and take another country in the ex-Russian Empire, ex-field of Russian influence that they feel is entitled, and that they're entitled to. You can't view these people as just motivated by economics. Nobody would have launched this war if they were purely motivated by economics. It just makes no sense.
Late last week, we saw the Telegraph report that Trump was set to recognise some Ukrainian parts as Russian territory, so particularly Crimea and Donbass, which would include areas that Russia hasn't even occupied yet. And just for the audience, Russia currently occupies around 88% of Donbass, so there's still around 12% that is in Ukrainian hands. So despite the fact that Andriy Yermak has now resigned last week, he did say in his swan song interview that not a single sane person today would sign a document to give up territory. So Jimmy, when you're speaking to Ukrainians, especially militants, what do they say about the possibility of giving up land?
So Andriy Yermak is not a particularly popular person in Ukraine. About 70% of Ukrainians wanted him to resign. But I would say that is one subject where Ukrainians would wholeheartedly agree with Andriy Yermak. Nobody is going to believe that if you give Russia this last sliver of the land in Donetsk, and it has to be mentioned that it might not be a huge amount of land, but that land is very, very well fortified. It has the big fortress cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. It has the bulk of the Ukrainian defensive lines in the east and southeast. So it might seem like a small amount of land to give up, but in reality, that land has far more strategic impact on Russia's ability to push into Ukraine than you might think. So, nobody really believes that if you give them this land, they will stop the war. And also, it would be an order that a Ukrainian government would have to try and get the military to accept, because the military, it would violate the Ukrainian constitution for a start, and the Ukrainian military would think that it's an act of betrayal. They would think it's an act of treason, giving up Ukrainian land to Russia that hasn't been lost on the field of battle. They would even believe that giving up Ukrainian land that has been lost on the field of battle would be an act of treason. They'd be prepared to accept some form of de facto acceptance that this land is currently occupied by Russia, but no Ukrainian that I speak to would be prepared to just give up this land, in perpetuity de jure to Russia. It's not something that Ukrainians would ever accept, I think.
If a peace deal did come down to land negotiations, and it prompted the US to kind of step out of the situation. They were like, you know what, we're not going to get anywhere because neither side is going to agree when it comes to land. Do you think that Ukraine is prepared to fight on without the support of the US in order to keep its sovereignty, in order to keep Russia out of the country? Because I guess the concern is if you give away land that they currently occupy, that 88%, who's to say that they wouldn't invade again in a few years to come? Because they've obviously got Russians already inside the country. It will be a lot easier then than it was in, February 2022. And if, they're just relying on, and it would require them to only rely on Europe and the rest of NATO, not just the US.
Yeah, no, everyone thinks that Russia would not stop until they're satisfied themselves with what they've taken of Ukraine. And most Ukrainians that I speak to believe that they want to take all of Ukraine, at least to the extent that they force Ukraine to be some form of puppet state like Belarus, that really has no independent foreign policy, that has no independent domestic politics, where elections are choreographed and run by the Kremlin. And that would mean the end of Ukraine as we know it. That would mean Ukraine becomes a subjugated state where Ukrainians can't, exercise their own political autonomy, which obviously they have every right to do so.
Marco Rubio said last week, Jimmy, that the US will only provide security guarantees to Ukraine after a peace deal is signed with Russia. So not only might Ukraine be asked to give up territory, but they might also not get the security pack. So where does that leave Ukraine? Does it leave it readying for a third invasion?
I mean, it's farcical, really. It's like saying, well, you can buy this car, but I'm not going to tell you the price until you've agreed to buy it. Ukraine cannot agree to any form of deal unless it knows, because obviously that deal would involve making concessions, almost certainly, and without knowing what security guarantees it might be provided, it can't agree to anything, because obviously the entire posture of the Ukrainian state towards Russia will be very much dependent on what security guarantees that's provided, right? You don't have to have such a big military if you've got foreign troops in Ukraine, for example, so you could maybe agree to have a smaller military, understanding that there are foreign troops in Ukraine that would then protect you if Russia decided to invade. That's, for example, how NATO works, right? NATO is a security defensive alliance, and it's a burden-sharing alliance, which means that smaller countries can afford to have slightly smaller militaries because they know that they have bigger and more capable allies. So, yeah, it's farcical. It makes no sense, and I really don't understand how they can ever expect Ukraine to sign an agreement based on that, really.
Well, there's been a lot of commentary around America's commitment to Ukraine, especially after this 28-point plan was leaked last week, showing the heavily pro-Russia draft. So this prompted even members of Trump's own party to speak out, or at least try and redirect the administration's policy in the public. So Mike Turner, a Republican, he went on, I think, Face the Nation, and he said this. He said, one thing that I think everybody understands is that you can't be America first and pro-Russia, because Russia is a self-declared adversary of the United States. It's fielding new advanced nuclear weapons that are specifically targeting the US. It's constantly attacking the US with offensive cyber. It continually identifies both NATO, the West, and the US as its adversary. You have to understand that the balance of this peace arrangement has to be on where you look at Russia as a skeptical adversary. So what do you think about that, Jimmy? Is he spot on?
Yeah, he's absolutely correct. Russia is not a friend to the United States. Russia has always been an enemy of the United States, and it has its own view of how the world should be, divided up. Essentially, the Russian view is that America, Russia, and China should have their own kind of spheres of influence, and that is fundamentally incompatible with how America used to view the world. I mean, the reason why the Americans set up, were key in setting up NATO and the post-war security order, is they believed that Europe should not be dominated by Russian, then Soviet, imperialism. And yeah, America needs to, I think, remind itself of what it stands for, and that, for many, many years, it stood for, at least notionally, freedom, democracy, liberty, etc. And obviously the way that they tried to achieve these goals were obviously very imperfect, and we can have a long discussion about failures of American foreign policy. But compared to modern Russian foreign policy, there's no comparison really. And I think America really needs to look at the world and think how they want to be viewed. Do they want to be viewed as a country that makes dirty deals with Russia and China, or do they want to be viewed as a country that actually stands up for the rights of smaller countries to live independently of foreign aggression? And I would hope it's the latter. And I think the statement that you were talking about, and speaking to other Americans that are kind of traditional Republicans, I've spoken to a few in the last few days, and they are kind of shocked about how these negotiations have been carried out. The fact that it's pretty clear that a member of Trump's team was completely played by Russia, handed this document translated from Russian into English and really passed off as an American plan when it was anything but.
Ukraine is in critical need of funding, Jimmy. There's expectations that the money could run out in the next few months. So the coalition of the willing has been meeting and promising to keep funding them. But the conversation in the last few months, or even in the last, 8 or 9 months, has been around unfreezing these Russian assets and giving them to Ukraine to fight on. So the EU is currently debating a 140 billion euro loan for Ukraine backed by these frozen Russian assets. But there are voices in Europe, particularly Belgium, that are warning of potential consequences. So Belgium, where the money is actually held, are arguing that by giving Ukraine these frozen assets, it could derail peace talks. So how critical do you think it is that the EU does this? And why do you think Belgium is so, apprehensive about this?
I mean, it's a ridiculous excuse trying to claim that it's going to derail peace efforts. It's almost perfectly echoing Kremlin narratives. I think, to be honest, for the Belgians, they want to keep these assets because they're earning a nice amount of money in tax revenue from interest on them. I would say that Belgium needs to be very, very clear about its position in Europe, and it needs to think very carefully about, is it going to be part of the solution or part of the problem? Because at the moment, European security is something that should be of paramount interest to everyone in Europe. And I understand that Belgium might think, okay, we're slightly further away from Russia, so we can maybe make policy that's based around our kind of marginal, narrow economic self-interest rather than, thinking widely about European security as a whole. But I think if you're, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, if you're one of these countries on the border of Russia, you need to be putting pressure on Belgium to make them, come around to the understanding that European security is the responsibility of everyone in Europe, and not just the countries on the border, because this money is critical and it's going to cost Europe, it's going to cost NATO a lot more if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine. It's going to cost in defense budgets, in support for refugees, because Ukrainians are not going to, if for example, if the Russian military pushes west again, Ukrainians are not going to stay here. There's going to be another mass exodus of refugees, and a lot of refugees have actually come back to Ukraine because the situation appeared to be getting better. So, yeah, I think it's kind of frustrating seeing countries just not really looking at the bigger picture. And that's always been a problem in Europe, unfortunately, that countries have kind of looked at their narrow self-interest and not looked at Europe as a whole. And I think we need to get past that. Europe needs to get past it. We need to understand that essentially we're all in it together. And although it might be nice for the Belgian economy and the Belgian exchequer to get this tax revenue from these funds, that the longer term risk of this kind of self-interested behaviour could be catastrophic for Europe as a whole and Belgium.
Well, just to elaborate on that, Jimmy, that new report from Kuriska Norwegian Institute of International Affairs estimates that if Europe helps Ukraine secure a victory, the cost over 4 years would be around 606 to 972 billion US dollars. But in contrast, if Russia gets away, meaning that Russia gets a victory or negotiated a more favourable peace deal for Moscow, the long-term cost to Ukraine could reach up to $1.8 trillion. So this would be, as you mentioned, by defence expenditures, refugee flows, instability and reconstruction needs. So it actually is in all of Europe's interests to be helping fund Ukraine now, as opposed to, facing this issue down the track.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I get that it's frustrating that you have to suddenly find a bunch of money because Russia invaded a country in Europe. And I totally understand that. And I know that budgets are squeezed. I know budgets are squeezed in the UK. I know budgets are squeezed across Europe. But the second that Russia decided to drive their tanks across the Ukrainian border in February 2022. It was going to cost Europe money. I'm sorry, there wasn't any solution where we could just ignore it and say, well, it's not going to cost us any money now. Because, again, if Russia wins, it gets Ukraine's natural resources, it gets its territory, it gets its, probably a lot of its population. Because what's happening in the occupied territories of Ukraine is Russia is mobilizing Ukrainians to fight against their own people. They're forcibly mobilizing Ukrainian civilians and drafting them to the Russian army, and then they're forcing them to go fight against their own people. So this is what would happen. And Putin he's not going to be satisfied with just Ukraine. It's just like Hitler was not satisfied with just the Sudetenland. He wasn't satisfied with just the rest of Czechoslovakia. He wasn't just satisfied with Austria. They're always going to want more. It's just how these people think. And you can look at Putin's writings, and you can look at the way that the Russian media talks about the Baltic states, talks about Finland. They don't believe that these countries actually have a right to exist because they are formerly parts of the Russian Empire. So, yeah, it's going to cost us money. It's going to cost a lot of money, but it's going to cost a lot less, not to mention the fact it's the morally correct thing to do if we aid Ukraine properly now. It's not a case that you can just put your head in the sand and pretend that this isn't happening. I'm sorry, it just isn't.
And let's get into kind of how Ukraine has been prevailing on the front line. So, Jimmy, Lindsey Graham has been waiting patiently to get this vote on his sanctions bill that would essentially invoke around 500% tariffs on countries that are importing Russian oil. He said that Trump had basically greenlit it and said, yeah, you can vote on it at the Senate floor, but it seems as if Trump might be stalling again as peace negotiations are still going on. But what we found in the past few months is that Ukraine doesn't wait for Russia's energy to take a hit. They do it themselves. So in the last few days, Ukrainian troops have struck a Rosneft oil refinery in Russia's Volga region, and Ukrainian naval drones hit two sanctioned tankers in the Black Sea as they were heading to a Russian port to load up with oil destined for other foreign markets. So, Jimmy, you've been following this along quite closely. So how successful has Ukraine been in this tactic as of late?
No, they've been very successful. There's been a sustained campaign of targeting Russian oil infrastructure. This campaign has used long-range strike drones to hit refineries and storage depots, and has obviously used sea drones. As you said, they hit two of the Shadow Fleet tankers in the Black Sea. They were empty, so there was no oil spill, but these tankers seem to be complete losses. And yeah, look, Ukraine has a lot of capability. They have very sophisticated drones. They have relatively deadly intelligence services, both the SBU and GUR. They can carry out operations outside of Ukraine. And I think if you see America and the rest of the West pull back in supporting Ukraine, they will kind of think, well, the gloves have come off now, we'll do whatever we want. And I know for a fact that some of their actions have been constrained by concerns of Western partners. And if those Western partners are no longer partners, those constraints really mean nothing. And you'll start to see the full capability of Ukrainian intelligence come to bear.
Well, Jimmy, just a final question. When you look at the Ukraine military and how they've kind of acted with or without any support from the US, or even at times when they felt let down by the EU, how do you look at the Ukrainian military, who have really stepped up to use little resources to create what is now perceived as, widely recognized drone technology that other countries will be viewing for years and decades to come? But also, this tactic of attacking Russian energy facilities has been so successful. So in years to come, when we look back on these moments, how do you think the Ukrainian troops will be viewed?
I think they'll be viewed as fighting the second largest army in the world to a virtual standstill in a war that they were supposed to lose in between 3 days, 3 weeks, depending on which assessment you take. They fought incredibly courageously, and they're still fighting incredibly courageously, and they are, without doubt, the most deadly drone operators in the world. They pioneered this technology. They're incredibly skilled, and I think, to be honest, that's another thing that Europe should consider and America should consider. If Ukraine falls to Russian occupation, you're going to have tens of thousands of the most deadly people on the planet wandering around without a country to call their own. What are they going to do?
Jimmy Rushton, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you.